Well, hi guys. I'm here with Jim Witty, and I want to ask him a few questions about his ministry experience. And so I'm just going to kind of let him talk, and I'll throw in some questions as we move along. I think Jim is the kind of guy that you will all want to learn something from. So, Jim, I wonder, can you just go ahead and talk about CareCore, describe what it is, what you do, and then we can move from there.
Okay, hey, great to see you. Yeah, CareCore started about 23 years ago. It was in response to the conflict in Bosnia. Remember the war that was going on there, and the church invited me to come over and to equip them. They didn't know how to deal with the refugees, the genocide, all that stuff. And I had just recently completed my clinical work in PTSD at Palo Alto, and so anyway, I went, and CareCore is involved in training the people on the ground, the pastors, missionaries, medical staff, nurses, whatever, the local people with some basic caregiving skills because they're dealing with a crisis and they don't know what to do. And they care, they have compassion, but they're not sure what to do. And so sometimes people say all they need is love. Well, actually, they need more than love, they need love, but they need some practical tools. That's what we found. And so CareCore is involved in two things. One, we provide, we coordinate and provide a team of Christian mental health professionals. I'm a psychologist. We take other psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, nurses, doctors, go with us who have had experience working with emotional trauma, a different level, abused children, whatever. And so we take them with us, a team, and we go to this, wherever it is, and we conduct a care seminar, we call it care seminar. So we're trained there with some basic um caregiving, compassion, ministry kind of tools. And because we work a lot with children, a lot of it has to do with teaching them these basic skills of using play therapy, art therapy, music, and so on. The second thing that we do is then we go back. And by the way, the key to missions is you're invited back. And it's always the key if you're invited back. If we're invited back, and then we conduct what we call a children's trauma care program. It's different than a camp because a camp can just be fun and games, whatever, and that has value. But ours is a psychosocial program, biblically based. We have a curriculum, and we conduct a program with the locals. Our goal is like 2 Timothy 2:2, train others so they can in turn train others. Okay, so we train them. We have a curriculum. We go through each day, and you were there with us, Dave, in Uganda years ago. And we go through and we have a curriculum, and we train them how to work with these kids using the play and the art and the small group counseling sessions and all the different approaches. And then at the end, our goal is to then be able to hand off to them uh, these tools, and we bring enough materials
Mm.
so that they will be able to continue to do that. And a lot of times they're in places where we can't go. It's not safe. And so that's basically what we do, those two things.
Okay. And so tell me a little bit because you mentioned that you're working with Christians. How does faith play in? And specifically, I know you see yourself as a missionary.
Yeah.
So how does that really play into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I believe that um, at the very bottom, and talk about reframing somebody's life who's been shattered by trauma. Uh, what you're doing are two things. One, you're hearing their story. They have to be able to tell their story, and that's a lot of what you're doing. But the second part you're doing, you're giving the education. You're helping them to put their life back together. And a big part of that is the spirituality part, and that is their understanding that there's a God who cares, a God who understands, a God who can restore their life and give them hope. Now, not only do we work with Christians, we work with many times in Muslim settings. Just working in Lebanon recently, just last month in Lebanon, we worked in many places with Muslims and invited by Muslim schools and invited in because we're not trying to do a hardline, hard press evangelism thing. but what we found is that when you bring these basic tools and they begin to understand, they certainly Muslim, the Islamic people, they're very open. I think because when you show compassion for their children, there's great welcome. And I think because of the way we handle that sensitively, we're not going to offend them or whatever. So we've been invited into many Muslim contexts.
So I know that when I was with you in Gulu, the materials that we used, because we did one of the camps, one of the psychosocial programs
Right,
with the kids,
right,
those materials were there were aspects of it that were very Bible based. Like we actually talked through some Bible stories, and that
right,
made sense because that was a predominantly Christian area. Most of
right.
those kids were already Christian, so it made
Yeah,
sense to support them. Do
right.
you adjust those materials when you're working in a predominantly Muslim context like Lebanon?
Oh, yeah, we do. In fact, for example, just not too long ago, working in Gaza, which is, you know, very Muslim, we use Joseph because that's in the Quran.
Yeah,
So we use in the context of the culture of the stories that they can understand. Uganda, where you were, is very much impacted by the Christian faith, but not so in Gaza or Lebanon or different place, or Jordan, whatever.
yeah.
Um, and so we use, like I said, we have different curriculums for different places.
So tell me about what are kind of your biggest successes? Like what do you feel the most satisfaction about having accomplished in this work?
Well, the real key is that you go back
Hmm.
because you don't just learn it one time. I mean, our board years ago decided that we're not going to make a commitment to go unless we go for 3 years. That means we go back. Because how do you learn? I mean, just take basic learning theory. People don't get it all at once, and so we go in, we train, then we come back again, and there's more training. By that time, people are ready. They tried this. How do I do this? How do I work with this? And so they're ready. And the other thing, you're building a relationship. You're building a relationship of supporting them because there's two parts to that. One is the actual skills that you're giving them, practical tools, but also you're caring for the caregivers. These are the people on the ground who
Yeah.
are dealing with this stuff day in, day out. I mean, everything from malaria to AIDS to genocide to whatever. And so you're the you're there with them, caring for them. And then the second part, you asked a question about satisfying. I just got back from Uganda and where you were, and it was so satisfying. That's the most I had the most enjoyable time because we were there training. We had 4 days of training. There were like 5 different groups from Southern Sudan and all different kind of groups. So we're training like 75 people, and then they started the Children's Trauma Program, which you know. But we were only there for like 3 days, and we were handing it off to them.
Hmm.
It's theirs.
Yeah.
And the satisfying part is to see that they really get it. They really understand this kind of compassion ministry, and they have some tools, and you see them using it, and they're taking it and they're training others. That's what's satisfying.
Yeah.
It's theirs. We always go in and we say, look, we're just going to share with you what God has given to us, and we're not saying this everything. It's not perfect and whatever, but we're going to learn with you from your culture how you deal with. Okay, but the satisfying thing is to see them take it. It's theirs, and they really begin to have some heart for working with children. A lot of times is understanding children. They don't real. A lot of cultures, children are not valued, not seen with kind of respect that I think we try to give to them. And so it's just exciting to see them really take an understanding of what they can do to help, what they can really do, some practical things they can do.
What if you were going to list off like three or four things that in that initial training session when you're trying to impart key pieces of wisdom, what would those be?
Well, the biggest thing for people working with trauma victims is they tend to talk too much.
Hmm.
They don't listen. I mean, you can't really know how to help a trauma victim unless you hear the problem.
Yeah.
unless you hear what's going on. So we try to move them from being great senders, because that's when you work with Christians. I mean, they're so excited about the message of Jesus, and they want to have people hear it, but they need to hear it. But the way I put it is like three peas in a pot. Okay, first is presence. There's the ministry of presence. You got to be there, and you got to be there, and you build, you really care. It's all that attending behavior, whatever. But you have to be there and build a relationship, because the two parts of that is they need to feel safe and they need to trust. I mean, they don't feel safe and they've been violated, whatever. And so it's the presence is building a relationship or trust with them. The second part is practice, presence and practice. There are things you actually do. I mean, working with refugees. I mean, there's the kind of helping people with displaced or who are dealing with the trauma themselves of being refugees and all the issues related to that. And the third part is proclamation. And that's the telling part. That's the part. But unfortunately, a lot of Christians reverse it and they put proclamation first.
Huh.
I'm not decrying proclamation. I'm just simply saying there's the proper time that you tell. You have to first know what the problem is. And they have to be able to trust that you care, that you're there. And I think that's the difference in the church from I've seen USAID, I've seen different UN programs and different, we've been in 26 countries, and so a lot of cultures, a lot of places, and I've seen a lot of programs. But I think the difference is that the church is there not only because they care, there's real compassion, but the church is a place that's a safe place.
Hmm.
It's a place where there's continual support. There's a place of real forgiveness. And also the people who are involved are not just doing a job, fulfilling whatever, but they're really there because they care. And that makes the world a difference. And so I think the church is uniquely the place, position really to go into places of crisis and trauma.
So can you comment on that piece a little bit then? How is it that CareCore works with local churches, or is it principally with local projects that you're working with, or how do those blend?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're always invited. We're there by invitation. And we can't accept every invitation. We're a real small organization, and mostly with using volunteers. So it's by invitation, and so we don't always accept every invitation either, because we want a good, reliable partner that we're going to work with. And also, we don't have the vehicles, the machines and whatever kind of stuff. We just provide the training. So we work with a church, like in Africa, it's often with the Anglican Church, the largest body, Baptist, Pentecostals, whatever. So we're not aligned denominationally. I mean, I happen to be a ordained pastor, but we're not with any one group. And so it can be with World Vision. I mean, started out years ago, we work in Uganda. It was trained the World Vision staff, World Relief, you know, and whatever group. But we're there by invitation. And then because of that good relationship, that good partnership, then often it connects us with other groups that, so you really find out on the field what are those really good programs? What are those really doing something? And we've been blessed. I've only a few times have I been disappointed that it hasn't been, where they're looking for American dollars and that sort of thing. But most of the time, we've been very blessed. It all started, I would say, years ago in Bosnia. This is years ago now, when I was there working, and the Billy Graham team came in to do a school, and the pastors there in Sarajevo talked to the Billy Graham team, asked for me to be one of the teachers. So I ended up working with training refugees and how to work with refugees and whatever. And I think that gave credibility. That was the beginning of helping that we're seen as a reliable evangelical you know, faith-based organization. I think that gave us that original credibility, so that people, you know, you don't know who you can trust. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there, and so I think that was the beginning of what really got us started the right way.
Can you talk a little bit about the you thank you for answering the question about local churches. I'm wondering though about churches in the U.S. and how those relationships have developed and how that works in terms of recruiting volunteers and all the other work that you do with those churches. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
Well, two parts there. First, working with the churches, like we worked a lot with churches in San Diego and Seattle, who have a large refugee population. Going back when, remember in 9/11, working with the churches in New York, a lot of working in church with the responders who had been affected and all the families. But as far as working with churches, most of our churches that you know that well, I'll put it this way, uh, we have to recruit people who go with us either for the training part or for the children's trauma part, children's program. And that's often coming from churches that we know, we work with, whatever. But most of them are students from like Fuller, Seattle Pacific, Azusa, Wheaton, whatever. Um, and so uh, we are faith-based, a nonprofit. So you obviously some contact with churches is trying to raise your support, trying to raise. A lot of times it's raising the money for scholarships for students to be able to go. It's raising money for the equipment that you have to take, all that kind of thing. And so we're a small group, and a number of churches support us in that way. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but
It is, yeah, and I know too. CareCore has also been kind of a family project for you for a long time. I mean, I know the only reason I met you is because your son was taking class from me, and he introduced me to CareCore.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I know John has continued to do trips on a fairly regular basis with you.
right.
And so I want to reinforce that there has been a series of Fuller students that have participated in the work of CareCore. I know Sua Cho was a pretty significant part of what was happening in CareCore
Right.
for a while,
Yeah,
and John Depphouse also. So yeah,
yeah,
there's been some great work there.
yeah.
Um, okay, so let's ask the harder question now, and that
Uh,
is, what are the biggest challenges that you tend to face in this work?
uh, well, I think the actual when you're actually training people, what I alluded to earlier is the biggest thing is trying to get them to be people who really are helping people to tell their story.
Hmm,
Getting people that shift in their thinking of what ministry is.
yeah.
It's not just the telling, it's not just the proclaiming. It is really entering into some because you know I would put it this way, Dave. You're hearing terrible knowledge. It really is. I mean, you're hearing the stories as you open up, and so you really have to choose to be there, to be present. You really have to choose to enter into that story because you're hearing stuff you wouldn't want to hear. What happens to children, the kind of stuff that children are forced to do, horrible stuff. And so, one, you're helping people to really move to a place. What I would call it's more than a heart for compassion. It's the action part of compassion, where you're really entering into that story and you're there. And a lot of times, people, you know, it's really costly. It's hard, and a lot of people they just want to go in, drop that message, and leave.
Hmm.
And so, and also, the other part about it, which you know, is secondary traumatization. I mean,
That was my next
it's
question.
okay. All right. Well, I mean, there's that issue that when you're working with trauma victims, it does affect you.
Yeah.
And that's what I have to deal with too, in terms of how many times I can go and come back and get myself back in a place where I can then go again, taking care of self-care, whatever. Because that issue of secondary vicarious traumatization, it does affect you. But I think you're only affected if you really touch lives.
Hmm.
I really do. I think it's costly. I made a mistake early on. We're trying to use mission dollars carefully and whatever, and so I would do too much, and I didn't realize I had to come back and I had to really recycle and get myself prepared. Well, I was preparing teams and all that, all necessary part too, but I also had to take care of myself. I was in. Let me tell you this quick story. I was in Jinja, which is the headwaters of the Nile. Okay, I was there, and I was working with all these missionaries. And during the chai break, this missionary came up to me, this British missionary, and he said, "I wish I had heard what you're talking about, because I was talking about secondary traumatization, self-care, all that kind of stuff." And he said, "I wish I had heard that." He said, "Because I didn't." He said, "I didn't take care of myself. He said, worse than burnout." I said, "Yes, it was worse than burnout." And he said, "So I had to go back to England." And he said, "It took me almost 3 years to get my health back, emotional health, my physical health, and my spiritual health." He said, "So I came back," and he said, I came and I thought there was only two options. I thought there were only two options, either rust out or burn out." And he said, "In terms of my faith, I was not going to rust out." So he said, "I did burn out." But he said, this is what I thought, the good British fashion. He said, "But I learned there's a third way, and the third way is to last out."
Huh.
And that's what we're trying to do,
Huh.
is when we're working on the field with these people who are working with trauma victims, we're trying to not only give them the practical tools so they can help the people, but also how to take care of themselves.
Hmm.
And a lot of times I have to talk with mission organizations that the people that are in these places of crisis, war, disaster, that if you don't take care of them, they're not going to be able to last. And I've had to help them see this not a spiritual problem. It's not because they're not committed, they're not dedicated, but because if you don't take care of them, they can't last out.
Can you, from personal experience and also plenty of conversations that I've had, it seems like this lesson about avoiding burnout, taking care of yourself, these are really only things that people start implementing after they've had a really rough experience. So if you were going to, other than the preventive care side of, yes, you need to take time off, those kinds of things,
Right.
what would you see as indicators that somebody is headed towards burnout? Maybe that's one way to tackle this, is to say, if you're starting to see these things in your ministry, maybe you need to take some time and figure out what's going on, reconsider. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Oh, yeah. Some obvious things are the atypical kind of behavior. Like they become very critical, they become very short, easily angered, and people that they would normally feel close to, they feel distant.
Hmm.
It's that really that change in behavior. But it's kind of like it really secondary traumatization is kind of like fog under the door because it seeps under and it begins to fill the room. You're not even aware of it.
Hmm.
And so the real key with dealing with secondary traumatization is you need to be connected with somebody else, not your spouse,
Hmm.
because that will be helpful, but not your spouse. You need to have another person that you're accountable to, that you're working with, and that you can talk about what's going on. Because the tendency is you tend to hold it inside,
Yeah.
and you tend to think I'm not working hard enough, I don't care. You're not realistic about the limitations that you're dealing with. And so you need to have somebody else, or you need a small group of people, of other caregivers that you are really in a covenantal kind of relationship where you talk about the kind of stuff that you can't talk to other people. And if you're worried about confidentiality, I don't mind telling people that I'm a part of a covenant group, that I'm responsible too. And so stuff that I hear that I'm not processing well, I mean, I have to talk to somebody. And that's the problem. They don't talk to somebody else and they keep inside and it gets them.
Yeah.
the issue of justice.
Huh.
Uh, 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 that's a big piece in dealing with trauma victims, is
Yeah.
because they've been violated. And the one of the basic yearnings of the human heart is and longing is for a sense of justice. Yes, I believe forgiveness is really important. I mean, but you can't rush into the whole issue of forgiveness with some trauma victim. I mean, it's just like they didn't understand the process of what the depth of the trauma that people experience.
Yeah.
It's kind of like it's not some superficial deal here.
Yeah.
This is a profound change in the brain chemistry. I mean, you talk about just in brain chemistry alone. I mean, I'm also aware that I believe God heals and God changes lives, but also I'm aware that this is something that's so significant in the brain chemistry that some of this is not going to, you're not going to change.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, all right. But I think they kind of have this view that, with God's, I don't know, it's kind of too simplistic.
Yeah.
It isn't that, it's much more profound than that.
Yeah.
I think that's why if the church it really has a place, the Christians have a place for dealing with those very moral issues.
Huh.
That because we do stress, like we say again and again, is it's not something's wrong with you, something wrong has happened to you.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a moral issue, something wrong has happened to them. Because kids, they assume it's their fault or
Right.
self-blame, all of it. But not just children. There's not just something wrong with you. And Christians often don't emphasize that because we're trying to somehow emphasize that unless you're a believer, we get all mixed up there. But
Right.
but it is a moral issue, and that's why we talk about the things we're trying to address as safety and trust.
Hmm.
And by the way, you've been in Uganda. One of the hard things is to get them to make that shift, so they don't just keep stressing, make this decision for Christ, uh, and until you really build the trust.
Yeah.
I just again had some of that. But the moral issue, the issue of being violated, something wrong has happened. I mean,
Yeah.
that's to me that's basic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so sometimes Christian groups get involved and they try to go in that little church they've contacted us and they're going to go out and do a trauma program. And it's just really hard to try to help them to be able to make that shift so that they understand there's God's grace, but also there's the issue of justice. That's why I often emphasize Psalm 139.
Hmm.
Psalm 139, I have that, what I call the 8 words of hope. And one of them is that which I bring in, that something wrong has happened to you, not something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Um, uh, that's why he was just so angry. I mean, you go through that psalm, the end he's just really angry, and that's an ordinate response.
Yeah.
It's you're incensed. You have all those feelings. So anyway, what we try to emphasize with the training to help people understand that and understand there's not something wrong with them because of their reactions. Because that's fitting. That's the right response.
Yeah.
Yeah, something wrong if you're not.
Yeah.
Yeah, like for example, I talk about terrible knowledge. There's something wrong with you if it doesn't just not only revile you, it just causes you to just overwhelm with this is wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what always affects me because when I'm out there, okay, I was in Lebanon working with these little Syrian refugee kids, I mean, some of the stories, and it just brings up this, because as a parent, as a grandparent, whatever, it's just the way it is.
Yeah. So going back to CareCore as a whole, I wonder if there's anything else that you feel like people ought to know about the organization or how they might be able to get involved. And I just want to open it up if you want to say anything further.
Okay. Well, would love to know people who would like to be a part of a team going out as trainers. We are constantly adding people who are part of our training team or would be interested in working with our children's trauma programs going, and they can always check out our website, carecore.org or carecoreint.org, either one. And check out our website. There's a place where people can even sign up. They're interested in being a mission volunteer. My phone is there. I mean, just call me. I'm available.
All right.
If and email that where that everywhere in the world. I mean, I've got email, so yeah, just contact me if you have interest. I'd love to begin a conversation with anybody, maybe in your class who would like to get involved. And also, we can connect you with perhaps other kind of ministries because 23 years ago, there weren't many folks doing this kind of stuff. I mean, you didn't hear about PTSD, you didn't hear about trauma, you didn't hear about Christian ministries. I remember talking to all these different groups, and they said, "Well, we don't do that." So, but now there are, and so there's some great connections, and I'm sure you can help them, Dave, with that. But I'd be glad to talk with anybody who would be interested in knowing how maybe they can be a part of a team to go out and be connected. We'd like to hear from them.
All right. Thanks very much, Jim. I really appreciate your time today. And
Great.
if I have any questions, I'll be directing people to your email, or I'll maybe field some questions and send some off to you. But thanks so much for your time today.
Okay, great to be with you, Dave. Bye
All right.
bye.